Welcome to Helsinki Open Waves. You are listening to Ferment Radio, a podcast series on bacterial and social fermentation. Fermentation can incite social action, spark creativity, and bring surprising new tastes to our lives. My name is Aga Pokrivka, and I invite you to join us in a conversation on living interconnectivities. From macro to micro, from societal to cellular, and from global to personal. There might be a much closer relationship between microbiology and shamanic practices than we think. As it is described by microbiologists and shamans, microbes and shamanic entities can be perceived under different circumstances. They have tiny but plural bodies and require specific substances to be nourished and sustained. They can be weakened or killed by a fever. They reproduce and act collectively. They live in bodies, soil, clouds, water, and objects. They might affect the soil's fertility and the dynamics of the sea and rivers. They can inflict infectious and mental diseases, but they can also cure animals and plants. They can impact human behavior. César Enrique Giraldo Herrera, a biologist, anthropologist, and a PhD in social anthropology, wrote a book about this fascinating topic. It is called Microbes and Other Shamanic Beings, and it questions the colonial interpretations of Amerindian shamanism. Since you are an author of Microbes and Other Shamanic Beings, could you tell me more about the core concept of this book, so everybody here, like me and our listeners, can kind of have a general idea what is it about, and most of all, what was your journey towards it?
Aga, thank you so much for the invitation. It's really nice to meet you, and it's really nice to be able to talk about the work. Okay, so microbes and other shamanic beings, I guess the big argument is that contemporary sciences were developed on top of translations of indigenous knowledge. That's the big argument. And the specific case that microbes and other shamanic beings is developing is that the notion of microbes resembles many things of indigenous knowledge about the entities that have been classified as shamanic spirits. Is the translation that it appears most frequently in the literature. But what I'm arguing is that the translation of spirits is very problematic, because it's a translation that is coming from missionaries and is coming with a very heavy load. And it was a translation that had a specific intention. So we can get into more detail about that. But the idea is that the notion of microbes was not a notion that was there before. And it has many elements in common with what shamans at the time were describing. Whether they were shamans is also shamanism is also problematic, but not as much. But these entities, in their early descriptions, they were called zemes. These entities have several characteristics, and what the book is doing is to trace the early descriptions, so the descriptions that the missionaries make of these entities as they want to translate them into spirits. Then it's examining means of perception of microbes that are at the disposal of shamans, and that would allow them to understand this reality or to have an idea about these realities. And then it's tracing a series of myths about syphilis, which was a disease that came across from the Americas and had serious impacts, not just for the world society, because it was a pandemic overall, but it had profound effects in how contagion was understood. So the first theory of contagion is produced right after contact by the person who makes the translation from this indigenous knowledge, who was Fracastoro, And he was he changes the word, so he uses semina, and it's the first time that you have a description of a contagion by an entity that is alive on itself and that attacks the body. Before that, you have humoral theory, so it was a completely different medical theory. And Fracastor tries to articulate this new understanding while keeping in line with the humoral theory. So he doesn't really understand what are the implications, but this was the first theory of contagion. And I would say that was a scaffold, so an ontological, a way of understanding that was constructed on top of it. Western science, European science built germ theory, and on top of that, microbial theory. So you have, and then these notions get removed and get forgotten. So the book is tracing that history of exchange and transculturation. And well, the process, the journey to get to that, I guess, starts in the Pacific. Well, it can start in many places, but one of the possible ones is the Pacific coast of Colombia. I was doing field work there with Afro-Colombian and indigenous peoples, and frequently you would hear stories about what they call the visions. And the visions are these extremely dangerous entities that would appear in the mangroves or at sea, and they could make you drown, or they could make you lost and mad, and drive you into perdition, basically. And I interpreted, so my first interpretation of those entities was that they were describing social and ecological relations in these environments and their dangers. And the problem with that interpretation was that it dismissed the reality that these entities have for the people over there. So you and the experience that is associated, because these are things that you perceive. So sometimes I would say, well, I perceive this and that, and they would tell me, well, that was the tunda. You just saw what was the tunda. And if you say this is an interpretation of the environment, you are dismissing the reality of that thing. So that was the first step. And then the second step was that I was working then for my doctorate in the Shetlands in Scotland with trawler fishers. And I was seeing many parallelisms in the things they would be doing and things that shamans would be doing ritualistically to cleanse food, for instance. The idea that you have to cleanse food and that there are processes. And in this context, this was explained as biosecurity. But if you would turn it into a shamanic context, this would be shamanism. And so one of the questions is, okay, what happens if we try this that appears to be very Western in an Amerindian context? And that was a detour from my doctorate. Unfortunately, my supervisor went along and helped me out through that moment. And then after I concluded with the research, came Microbes and Other Shamanic Beings as a book.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the interest itself, or even the idea that shamanism, like Amerindian shamanism, has anything to do with microbiology. Where did it come from? Is it something that, because to be very honest, before reading your book, I had no idea about this notion. I never heard this concept. And I'm just curious, is there already any research existing on this topic, or you were kind of, walking the path for the first time?
Okay, there have been some works which are tracing, for instance, epidemiology in indigenous communities, and that trace also how the notions of microbiology are being translated back into indigenous culture. And that has a problem, and that is assuming that there's nothing in common. That this is a Western idea that is competing with the alternative, which is the indigenous idea. And I would say that's really problematic, because it's a fight you can't win. It's the wrong dialectic. It's assuming that you are competing. Is as if I tried to put the response and the question, and then I said, well, the response was correct. When in fact, what you have is a process of translation that is longer. So there are works that are saying, okay, for example, the maraca is the equivalent of the microscope for the shaman. It's a tool, and in that I agree. But the reasons behind it are slightly different. I guess the passage through the Shetlands was important, because it was, for instance, you have the Mariel, and the Mariel in the Shetlands is some kind of lights that appear at sea, and the explanation for those lights is microbial, is I think diatomeas or something like that. So you have a phenomenon which is being explained through microbiology, and which in the past had interpretations that were magical. And that's something that helps the idea. But in other senses, it's a novel. Yeah, it's a bit. Yeah, I don't know whether it will end up working or not, or how. But there are more works which are going in that direction. There are microbiologists who are starting to take on the idea. Cliff Capono, for example, made his dissertation in Hawaii. Aviaya. There is a lot of people who's working on things that are related.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And could you describe for us a particular practice, like a shamanic practice from the region you were kind of focusing on in your research, which was totally misinterpreted from kind of a Western perspective, in a way that, you know, it was interpreted as spirits or whatever else through like this, I don't know, Western or Christian lens. But actually we are now able to kind of use another language to describe it. Am I asking for something too complicated? Are we even able to talk about those things like, I don't know, like outside of the cultures which shaped us?
I think we can trace the. Okay, so if you talk to a Hawaunana shaman today, he'll tell you what he's doing is a spiritual work, and so the translation has some aspects which are easily encompassed. You are dealing with things that have to do with emotions, with thoughts, and you're dealing with entities that have intentionality, subjectivity. So these are beings that want things, and these are beings that desire things. And then you also have things in these translations that don't work that well. So if you take these entities, they have bodies, and if you take a very strict theological interpretation, spirits don't have bodies. Period. End of discussion. You are wrong. And what would happen when you have this is that the friars would tell you, well, what you are describing are spirits, but you don't understand right what you're talking about. So you got it wrong. So it's a translation that betrays, but betrays in the wrong way. because you are not changing your way of thinking. They have to change. So what you are translating has to change their understanding. Or if you take these are entities that are closely related with animals and plants and soils and bodies of water. So, or rocks. If you talk about transubstantiation, if you talk about the passing the spirit, for a Christian, passing from a person to another person is difficult, is heretic, but passing to an animal, or to a rock, that's just pretty much out. So in these interpretations, there were already things that didn't work. I would say that we don't have just one frame of translation available. We are working simultaneously with many, and the trick is not to forget that if you take science, there are multiple sciences that might have a better grip than the one you're trying. So microbiology might work, and it might not be sufficient. And perhaps what is more important is that if we are going to translate indigenous concepts, microbiology is going to have to change. So microbiology will have to betray itself and learn. And in this case, what is suggested is, okay, you should consider these entities as having intentionality and as having their own interests. And that is something that is much, much more difficult and is a big question for microbiologists. Can you do that? Which also poses a lot of different things, which are already in the Amerindian concept. So if you talk about these entities, in many cases, they not only have one body, but have multitudinous bodies. And they permeate, and they are found in specific parts of one body or constitute specific parts of that body. They produce disease, but also mental diseases, madness. So it encompasses, but it's not enough. And also what they are describing are a variety of entities. So that's also the reason is microbes and other shamanic beings, because microbes might be some of them, but it's not necessarily all. So you have cases in which what they are describing are entities that produce diseases. So you have, for example, for the gunadule, you've got ponycortiquid, and ponycortiquid produces malaria. But ponycortiquid looks like an elephant, sort of. And it's very strange because we don't have elephants. So it's more the image of the elephant. So you see many processes of translation that happen there already. But perhaps the key element is that, yes, you can't reduce and be very strict. You have to be generous. And at the same time, you've got to be disciplined and try to follow, okay, are they describing also this? And if you find correspondences that go beyond the specific understanding, then you have something that I think is interesting.
Mm-hmm. And I just realized that I didn't ask like the core question, like when in this conversation we use the word shamanism or shaman, what do we actually mean by that?
Okay, that's a toughie because there are many practices, and part of many practices that are different and are not necessarily related, or not completely related. So you have variations from, for example, groups where the shamans don't require any substance, or require substances that are not necessarily hallucinogenic. So for the gunadule, for instance, is cacao and chili burn. These are not hallucinogenic, and tobacco. These are not particularly hallucinogenic substances. In that case, it's more the shaman who's special and who has a special way of being born and a special way of being raised. And that is a special person who, following a special education, can come to perceive these entities. You have other groups in which anybody can be a shaman. Frequently, these are the ones that use stronger substances. Then you have some groups like the Wonana where they have divided the tasks. So in the case of the Wonana, you would have the Pildecera, who's a woman usually, who will be the seer. And she is the one who's seeing what is happening, who's seeing these beings or persons, and is the one who verifies that the shaman, the person who's classified as a shaman, who can't see but can talk to these entities, can communicate with these entities. So they have the Waunana have divided the tasks. You have the healer, who will be chanting and talking continuously to these entities, and who will have his batons with beings that have been transmitted by other shamans. And you will have the seers who will be checking that the shaman is employing them, or checking that one shaman passes to the other the beings and is keeping the beings. So I guess there are many different practices, and one of the questions is, were these practices part of a general thing? Because they also present many similarities. Is also a way of understanding reality. So it's not necessarily circumscribed to the Americas, but it's found pretty much all over the Americas. But you find it also in the circumpolar north. You find it in Southeast Asia, in some parts of South Asia, East. So it is pretty widely distributed. Frequently, it has to do with managing these entities that are pathogenic, are related with some animals or plants or soils, but is a bit difficult to define for that reason. The term itself is of Siberian origin, although again you have things that are very similar. So the zeme it has something in there, although that's also something that appears to me is not widely distributed. So yeah, it's what is shamanism is a difficult question as well.
But what I got from it is that it's basically about like the practice of connecting or somehow relating to those entities. This is what I kind of understood from all this. Of course, it's very problematic for so many reasons, but I think this is what I take from myself. I hope I didn't, I don't know, reshape it too much in the translation.
No, I think it works.
Okay. So if it is about this relationship to those entities, and what we said at the beginning, that following your research on microbes and other shamanic beings, in this way, some of those entities which shamans are interacting with could be the microbes, right?
Yeah.
So how this interaction works, like how this connection is possible?
Okay, so you mean the perception part?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, there are several ways in which we relate with microbes constantly. The smell. Pretty much most smells that you are going to come across are of microbial origin. If you take your coffee, if you take your chocolate, if you have the smell of your dearest one, all these things are microbes are behind them. So we can perceive with a high degree of detail. If you think about it, our sense of smell is just wonderful for detecting the presence of microbes, their subproducts. Is just much better than a spectrometer, or you are going to get a much more detailed picture, much more precise than you would get with most chemical analysis. So that's a start. And that appears also in shamanic understandings. So the way they would describe some of these entities was because of the smell. If it has a particular smell, it might be there. Something that was very important and is very important for many groups is vision. And vision with detail. So it's a vision that is very rich, and the degree of richness is representative of the capacity of the shaman. So the capacity to describe in high detail or to depict in high detail what they are seeing is part of what gives shaman their recognition by the community. So that presented a huge problem. And that was something my supervisor kind of put forward pretty early. And it was, okay, you are making all these assumptions, but they can't see microbes, or can they? And that was a bit funny, because in that moment, I just saw a small floater passing through by my eye. I don't know if you have ever seen floaters.
Yeah. I know what you mean.
Okay, so suddenly I'm talking with him and I'm seeing this floater, and I remember that someone told me that is a piece of detached retina. And wait a second, if it's a piece of detached retina, that's microscopic. So I told him, okay, just give me a couple weeks and I might have the response to that. But it was just a coincidence at the moment. So I went and I started looking up what is this story about detached retina, and I ended up finding out about Purkinje's dissertation. Purkinje is one of these ultra famous biologists of the 18th, 19th century. It turns out he did his dissertation about entoptics. And his dissertation was making a lot of experiments with his eyes in order to see the structure of the eye. So the eye has kind of a wacky structure, which in biology is sort of the final joke, because you have all the blood vessels, and the blood vessels are all in the path of light between the outside and the photoreceptors of the retina. So it's like if you had a camera and all the cables were in front, and not just they are in front, but they are just at the right distance that they will be visible, because they could be close enough that you would not see them, but they are just far enough that you should be seeing them all the time. And so what happens is that the brain makes a huge effort to cleanse the image and to dampen the signal of those areas, which is very difficult because you have things that are moving there. And anything that is moving through your field of vision calls the attention of the brain. So this is a mega task, which is very demanding. It takes a lot of acuity of the eye. It takes a lot of information, things that you are not going to see. and puts a lot of things that are not there. But he managed to find some ways in which he could fool the eye. He also did some experiments with some hallucinogenics, but that's not to the main point. Most of the experiments he's doing are experiments with light. And so with light, he manages to map his retina, the blood vessels of his retina. He also describes and paints some very beautiful images of the whole tree, which now is called Purkinje tree, and is in the eye. And also he depicts some white blood cells.
So basically, he was putting the light straight into this eye with various angles to see these blood vessels and so on. Oh,
yeah.
Wow. So basically, anybody could do that.
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty much there. Those methods, many of them were refined by Helmholtz. So it works better, for instance, if you are working with a light that is vibrating. And you can also see them in other circumstances. So, for instance, when you have low levels of sugar, low levels of oxygen, high levels of carbon dioxide, or when you have not only hallucinogenic drugs, but also antibiotics, then the system dampens down and you start seeing these things. And so one of the arguments that is going over there is, okay, perhaps there is already a mechanism in there to see what is happening inside your body, but which you turn off when you are not using it because it would be a nuisance most of the time. So, yeah, Purkinje was very helpful, and I was playing with lights almost for 2 months. So I was doing many of the experiments myself. And then I was trying to estimate, okay, how much could you actually see? Because that's the other problem. Okay, you can see white blood cells. That's already a good start because a white blood cell is 6 to 15 microns, which is a big microbe. Not most microbes will be small, but then you don't want to go that far to make claims that are a bit too much. So, for instance, you have the author of the serpent, and he makes some claims about how they can see DNA, and that's just problematic because DNA you can't see even in the laboratory. If the strands and all that structure is a crystallized structure. That's not something that is out there. It's something that you produce. So that would be problematic. So, okay, the question was, how much can they see of the microbial world? And the conclusion is, okay, if we want a rough measure, then we can make some calculations because of the geometrical properties of this vision, of this form of vision, and because of the size of the sensors. So a limit to how much they could see would be something like 5 microns, 0.5 microns. That would be the absolute most, and that's just because that's the size of the photoreceptors and the size of the shadows produced by things in the retina. So that would be kind of the least, but that's with null resolution. So that would be very, very small. Then if you think about frequently you're not going to find a single microorganism, but you are going to find communities. And you have that in some instances, you can use these methods to trace the progress of diseases. So they are being used by ophthalmologists at the time. Then you can say, okay, a community of microbes you could perceive. That would be easier. So you have things that you could do with perception. And then the third question was, okay, now we can argue that as a person you might have visual access to the microbial world, but then the question is whether shamans are doing that. And the way to try that out was with depictions, and in this case, it was a Colombian, an Ingano artist who's called Carlos Jacanamijoy. He's the son of a very renowned shaman, Florencio Jacanamijoy, and well, he became a painter. He became a plastic artist, and he had a very interesting process, and he started depicting these very interesting images, which combine part of the shamanic understandings, but not in a. Usually, when you have shamanic art, is very figurative, is very symbolic and very loaded, and what he does is much more abstract. He's going towards depictions of the figures. And what I find when I analyze his paintings is that the paintings have the geometry that you would expect of this form of vision. And that can be expanded to other artists. You will find in other artists similar features, although frequently they will be enriched with symbolic content on top of the figure. So the argument was, okay, yes, from these, what you would get is what they are seeing, the way they are depicting it, coincides with what would be an entoptic microscopy, which is the name of that.
Mm-hmm. So basically, anybody of us can see the microbes, right?
With training, you need to have good eyes to start with.
Uh-huh.
So they were right on that. If your vision is not very good to start with, it's going to be more difficult. So what is interesting is in the early story of microbiology, seeing entoptics was a problem because people kept seeing them all the time. When you have, I don't remember the name of the light, diffuminated light, it becomes very easy to see entoptics. And so people kept seeing things that were inside of their eyes, and it was a whole process of training to unsee them. So you have to also be aware that you're training yourself not to see them.
What would come out of this interaction or a vision of, let's now say it, microbes or other shamanic beings? What would be the aim of this kind of practice?
Of seeing?
Yes, like if
so
some image appears, what kind of what kind of role does it have, or what kind of meaning?
One of the things that is in there is that a factor in common in many of these traditions is that the shaman is permeable. The shaman is a person who's permeable to these entities, is penetrated by these entities more easily than other people. So it inverts the whole idea of the Western medic. The Western medic is very detached from the patient. In this case, is a very close contact with the patient, and the way of seeing depends on either the shaman coming in contact and describing it for themselves, or the patient describing it to the shaman, describing what is happening, the experiences that they are having. This is not going to be reduced. So this should be taken as a basis. The point in here is that behind the visions, not everything is imagination, but there is a reality that is being grasped. Then you have other things that are happening. If you have visions with ayahuasca or with what you'll see is more than entoptics. It's much more complex. It has many different things. But what was important for me at that point was to say, okay, there is in this seeing a reality, and we shouldn't discard it, because what missionaries did very frequently was to say what shamans are doing is to get wasted. They are just drunkards, and they just get drugged with these things, and then they see the devil, or they claim to see the devil. So the important point was, no, there is a seeing here. They are seeing their body from within, which, when you think about it, is a very powerful thing to say, that you are able to see within your own body, and that you can do, or you can inform a diagnosis with things that are happening inside your body, is a radically different statement to say that you got wasted, or that your medic got wasted and you told him things and he did something. So that changes the value that we give to this information. In this case, there is extra information, there is extra knowledge that is being acquired through these practices. And there is a possibility of coming in contact with these beings, because you are interacting with them, you are seeing them. And that allows for a different approach, which was also one of the key parts of, and is one of the key parts of indigenous approaches to reality. So, whereas if you take the Judeo-Christian faith, is a faith, you have to believe in something, and you are not going to be able to see it, but you have to believe it. That went completely, and that still goes very much against the grain in indigenous societies. There's a quote from a friar working in Antilles. His name was Breton, and he was working with the Kalinago, and what he said was, these people won't believe in anything that they cannot see or use. So what he was dealing was with staunch empiricists and utilitarians who would not give credit to an abstract idea of God. They have to see it. And for them, it doesn't make a difference whether you see it in person or in dreams. It has the status of reality because you are seeing it. So it changes the status of things. Dreams are something that have a sense of reality because they are also independent from you, and you can also learn from them. Then the other aspect that is very important in many indigenous and very animistic contexts is that things might be persons. It's not that they are per se. It's not the assumption of you, Aga, are a person. You might not be one. I'm not sure. But if we start talking and you start making questions to me, and these questions are difficult, then I have to be more careful with you, and I have to acknowledge your personhood. And it's the same. If you are paddling in a river and you're not paying attention to the river, then you might not realize that there are places in which the river might play with you. So the river might have a personhood, and you have to take it into account. And if you interact with the river enough, you'll come to realize that the river has intentions, that it has its own ways of flowing, and that if you go against them, well, you might suffer the consequences.
We could talk about this all indefinitely. There is so much to relearn here. Therefore, I warmly invite you to delve even deeper into microbiology, shamanism, and decolonization, and read the book of César Enrique Giraldo Herrera, Microbes and Other Shamanic Beings. If you would like to know more about the show, listen to this episode again, or find previous episodes, please go to HelsinkiOpenWaves.com or FermentRadio.com. You can subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. I'm always looking forward to hearing from you at hello@fermentradio.com. Ferment Radio is broadcast by Helsinki Open Waves, supported by Culture of Cultures, and produced by Super Eclectic. Thank you for listening, keep fermenting, and stay tuned for the next episode of Ferment Radio.